My husband Bob and I are in our second year of marriage. While I may not excel in many areas, cooking is my forte. Your cooking is really delicious, Bob once said. That compliment, given on the lunch I prepared for our first date, was what made me fall for him. After 6 months of dating, we got married, and I left my job to become a full-time housewife. About a year ago, my father-in-law passed away, leaving just my mother-in-law, Bob, and me living together. I had hoped we could experience some time alone as newlyweds, even briefly, but when Bob said, "Mom's been feeling vulnerable since Dad passed away," I couldn't refuse. Shortly after starting our married life, I realized my mother-in-law didn't like me. I had encountered bullies at my old job, but she was worse. She constantly found fault with everything I did. While I was cleaning, she would point out every tiny spot I missed and say, "What's this brown spot? Can't you see it?" Once, she forced me to try to remove an unremovable stain from the floor, making me scrub it repeatedly. I wasn't allowed to stop until Bob came home from work. She would wake me up in the middle of the night and demand, "We're almost out of plastic wrap. Go and buy some now. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep just thinking about it." Since the grocery store was closed, I had to run to the nearest convenience store. If I tried to wake Bob, she would explode in anger, saying, "How dare you wake your tired husband? House chores are the wife's job." To avoid her wrath, I had no choice but to obey. These midnight errands were physically exhausting, but having my belongings thrown away or hidden was even more mentally draining. "I don't know where your stuff is. Maybe you left it somewhere," she would say whenever I couldn't find my things. It's awful to blame others for your own mistakes. I can never forget how shocked I was when I found my favorite cardigan in the trash can a few days later. When I told Bob what happened, he just sighed heavily. "Well, you can just buy a new one," he said. I also tried in vain to persuade him to talk to her. Not knowing what else to do, I bought a safe with the money I'd saved before marrying Bob. I kept my belongings out of her sight, especially my valuables, which I stored in the safe. It's crazy to distrust your own family like you do. I'd like to see the face of the person who raised you. Her harsh tone intensified, and every time she opened her mouth, I had to brace myself for the inevitable verbal attack. She criticized every meal I cooked, saying, "Too bland," or "No taste at all." When I tried to make the dishes more flavorful, she complained they were too spicy. I began to doubt my cooking skills and couldn't help asking my husband for his opinion on the taste. "Mom has very strong food preferences. I think it's delicious," he said. Cooking, once a joy, became a chore. After a year of enduring my mother-in-law's bullying, I had an epiphany. Staying home all the time was the problem. Realizing this, I decided to start working part-time. I had quit my job to be a housewife as Bob requested when we got married, but if staying at home was this painful, I wouldn't have left it so easily. Despite a slight gap in my career, I was valued for my quick learning skills at my part-time job, and it simply felt good to be praised again. However, as I spent less time at home, my mother-in-law began to focus her harassment during breakfast and dinner times. She used to eat despite her complaints but started leaving most of the food untouched, barely taking a bite before leaving the table. I lost count of the times she accidentally knocked over her soup bowl. When I swallowed my pride and asked her what was wrong with the meal, she'd laugh and say, "You think asking will solve everything, don't you? Why don't you try thinking for yourself?" I was left alone to clean up her leftovers at the dinner table. One day, my mother-in-law really crossed the line. While we were having dinner, she suddenly stood up, took her plate in her hand, and headed to the kitchen. As I looked up in surprise, our eyes met, and she smirked. "What?" By the time I realized what was happening, she had already thrown the meal I made into the trash can. "This is such an awful-looking meal. Even dog food would look better than this," she scoffed. I looked at Bob in disbelief, but he just ignored me and continued eating. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, so I rushed to the trash can. I opened its lid and stared at the ruined food. "This is terrible." I turned around to see Bob, but he wouldn't even look at me. She probably wasn't feeling well. He dismissed his mother's actions. How could she throw the food away right in front of the person who made it? I asked, growing more upset. Bob scratched his head in annoyance and said, "Look, I have work tomorrow. Unlike you with your part-time job, I'm a full-time employee working hard from morning to night. What's wrong with doing a part-time job? I work, cook at home, and then have my cooking thrown away by your mother." My voice broke with emotion, and he sighed deeply. "Lisa, you're becoming a nag. Mom's probably irritated by your nagging too. you know. And if it's that bad, then you shouldn't be cooking anymore. After saying that, Bob walked into his bedroom, leaving me staring at his back in disbelief. At that moment, I finally realized he didn't care about me at all. Something inside of me just snapped. The next day, I prepared breakfast as usual and let both Bob and my mother-in-law know it was ready. Bob sat down to eat, but my mother-in-law grabbed her plate and said, "Not even a dog would eat this in the morning," then threw her breakfast in the trash can. Without a word, I stood up and took away the breakfast I prepared for Bob. "What?" he said, looking bewildered. "I will have it." I quickly sat down and started eating his breakfast, ignoring my mother-in-law's actions and Bob's growing frustration. "Hey, why are you eating my breakfast? What are you doing?" they both exclaimed. I looked at them innocently and replied, "Well, since your mother said a dog wouldn't even eat this, you shouldn't be eating it either. I'll take responsibility for what I made and eat it myself." "No, I didn't say that." "But you didn't deny what your mother said, did you?" Bob opened his mouth but seemed unable to find anything to say. "Lisa, stop talking nonsense and make Bob's breakfast," my mother-in-law snapped. I looked straight at her with a smile. "I'm very sorry that I have been serving you the sort of food that a dog wouldn't even eat. Don't worry, I won't cook for you ever again." I grabbed my knife and fork, finished eating breakfast, and stood up. Bob said, "Wait, Lisa, what about my breakfast?" "Eat whatever you like," I replied, then left the house quickly. I usually return home around 5 p.m., but that day I had a few errands to run after work, so by the time I got home it was already past 8 p.m. "Oh, you're very late. We've been waiting for you." "Really, where on earth have you been?" Bob and my mother-in-law complained, looking very hungry. "Oh, haven't you two eaten yet?" "I already had my dinner." My mother-in-law's face turned red with surprise and anger. "How dare you eat alone?" "Well, I did say I wouldn't cook for you anymore. Or were you looking forward to my terrible cooking?" "How dare you talk back to me like that?" she shouted, slamming the table in frustration. But then she quickly regained her composure and came up with what she thought was a brilliant idea. "If you're not cooking, then return the food money. Bob has been paying for all the living expenses, so you should pay him back every penny you spend on your food." I couldn't help but laugh at her confident declaration. "What's so funny?" she demanded. "Since I started working part-time, I've been paying not just for food, but all living expenses." It was Bob's suggestion. I turned to him. "Mom isn't happy about your working, but if you pay the living expenses, it might calm her down," he had said to me. It had been over a year since I started my part-time job, which means I had been covering the living expenses for the last half of our married life. My mother-in-law, apparently unaware of this, looked shocked and turned to Bob. "Is that true, Bob?" "Well, you wanted more pocket money," Bob mumbled weakly, making excuses. He had me cover the living expenses so he could use the extra money for his mother's allowance. "You seem to have been spending quite a lot on extravagant meals." In the mailbox, I found a flyer for regular customers at an upscale restaurant. I had thought my mother-in-law made her own lunch, but after seeing the flyer, I had my suspicions and found some receipts from that restaurant in the trash. Shouldn't the proper thing be to pay back all the living expenses I've provided? After all, it was my hard-earned money. "Don't worry, I'll be sure to bill you properly," I said with a bright smile to my mother-in-law, who was trembling with anger. "Hey, what do you mean by billing?" Bob, perhaps sensing something, turned pale and stood up. "I want a divorce, and of course, I'll make sure I ask for alimony." "Divorce?" he muttered in shock, but then brightened up, thinking he found a flaw in my plan. "Do you think you can afford to live on your own with what you earn from your part-time job?" He probably thought I would struggle financially. "About that part-time job, I've been offered a full-time position." "What?" "I've also decided where I'll live." My actual plan was to commute from my parents' home for a while, I said, watching the realization dawn on him. "I'll get my lawyer to handle the proceedings from now on." With those words, I went to my bedroom and grabbed the luggage I had packed the night before. Bob, still in shock, stood frozen by the dining table. I ignored him and walked past. "Lisa, I'm sorry," he called out, making me stop and turn around. "Sorry for what? What do you mean?" I asked, exasperated. "It was hard to take sides between you and Mom." "I never said anything bad about your cooking, did I?" he replied. He doesn't understand anything at all. In the end, I truly realized I had been blind. It's not about taking sides. You chose to say nothing when the food was being thrown away and when I was being harassed by your mother over and over. Despite my pleas, you never helped me. Your playing the victim doesn't change the fact that you hurt me. I reproved him. Bob started crying bitterly. Seeing the gravity of his sorrow, I quickly glanced at the pathetic man and headed toward the front door. As I reached for the door, my mother-in-law called out to stop me. I never intended for things to get this bad. I was amazed at how oblivious she was to the severity of her actions. I've looked after you all this time, and it's disappointing that the last thing I hear from you is such an excuse-like response. From now on, you won't have to worry about being caught for spending a lot of money on delicious meals. My mother-in-law stood frozen, her eyes wide open as if her breath had stopped. I returned to my parents' house, where they warmly welcomed me, already aware of my situation. According to my lawyer, everyone in the neighborhood knew my mother-in-law was incapable of household chores. Apparently, my father-in-law had managed the housework when he was still alive. After his passing, Bob, now my ex-husband, and his mother lived on takeout and eating out. To them, I was a convenient housekeeper to exploit. The news about our divorce quickly spread throughout the town. Eventually, it reached Bob's bosses and colleagues, causing him considerable embarrassment. Bob and his mother are now in financial trouble, having hardly saved any money and squandering it all. They are panicking over the alimony they owe me. Now that everybody knows about their mistreatment of me, finding a new housekeeper has become impossible. They can't even afford the kind of meals they used to have. Bob, unrelenting, kept texting and asking if we could get back together. I also received messages from my mother-in-law filled with excuses, but they were repetitive and uninteresting, so I stopped reading them. Now, I enjoy cooking for my family, making sweets and baking cakes on weekends. I often share my creations with my colleagues. Surrounded by those who appreciate my cooking, I believe this will help restore my confidence. With this new hope, my heart